The emergency session of the Deathworld Alliance convened in the depths of space aboard the Mogul Fortress. Eternal Rock, 3 species that had never bowed to any threat, now faced extinction. The Void Swarm had consumed 17 star systems in less than a standard year, and their mechanical plague showed no signs of slowing. Ambassador Thane pressed his crystalline fingers against the war table's surface. His silicon-based body gleamed under the harsh lights as he studied the tactical displays. The rockburn had survived on worlds where volcanic glass fell like rain and molten rivers carved through diamond mountains. Yet even their legendary endurance meant nothing against an enemy that simply consumed everything in its path. Warchief Blaze shifted restlessly across the chamber. Her scales glowed with internal heat as radiation coursed through her body like lifeblood. The burn-scale species had evolved in the hearts of dying stars, feeding on cosmic radiation that would cook most organic life forms in seconds. Her people had never retreated from any battle, but the swarm offered no honor in combat. It simply arrived, consumed, and moved on. Ice Commander Frost remained motionless in her environmental suit, her breath creating small clouds of vapor in the frigid air her species required. The Frostkin had conquered the frozen outer reaches of dead systems, thriving where temperatures dropped below what most species considered possible for life. Their patience was legendary, but even patience had limits when facing an enemy that converted entire worlds into more of itself. The holographic displays showed the same grim reality from every angle. Conventional warfare had failed. The Void Swarm adapted faster than any living species, incorporated destroyed technology into its collective, and grew stronger with each victory. Every weapon the Alliance deployed became another tool for their enemy within days. Thane's voice resonated through the chamber like grinding stone. He had reviewed every military database, analyzed every tactical option, and reached one unavoidable conclusion. The Alliance needed help from outside their traditional understanding of survival and warfare. The Ambassador activated a new display, showing a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The planetary classification made the other commanders recoil slightly. Class 12 Deathworld. The designation alone suggested conditions so hostile that even the Alliance species would struggle to establish basic settlements. Frost's translator crackled as she spoke through her environmental systems. She questioned the wisdom of seeking aid from a species that had never faced galactic-level threats. Their intelligence report suggested the humans had barely achieved faster-than-light travel and maintained only primitive defensive installations. Around their home system, Blaze's internal temperature rose as she expressed her doubts more directly. Her people valued strength and proven combat ability. The humans appeared physically weak, lacked natural armor or environmental resistances, and seemed to require elaborate technological support just to survive in conditions the Alliance considered mildly uncomfortable. Thane acknowledged their concerns but pointed to the environmental data from the human homeworld. The planet's surface featured extreme temperature variations, violent weather systems, dangerous atmospheric conditions, and geological instability that made it barely habitable by galactic standards. Yet somehow an entire civilization had not just survived but thrived in these conditions. The Rockburn Ambassador explained his reasoning with the methodical logic his species was known for. Every other approach had failed because the Alliance kept trying to outfight an enemy that grew stronger through conflict. Perhaps they needed allies who approached problems differently, who had learned survival techniques unknown to species that evolved on more stable worlds. The debate continued for several cycles as each commander weighed the risks. Inviting an unknown species into their military operations violated numerous security protocols. Sharing their advanced technology with a primitive civilization could create future complications. Most importantly, admitting they needed help from such a young species would damage the Alliance's reputation throughout the galaxy. However, the alternative was extinction. The Void Swarm would not pause to consider their pride or traditions. It would simply continue consuming until nothing remained of their ancient civilizations. The final vote was close, but necessity overcame pride. They would extend an invitation to the humans, offering membership in the Deathworld Alliance in exchange for military cooperation against the swarm. The message was crafted carefully, emphasizing the honor of joining such an exclusive organization, while downplaying the desperate nature of their situation. 3 weeks later, the human response arrived in the form of a small fleet emerging from jump space near the Eternal Rock. The ships appeared crude by Alliance standards, built more like mobile habitats than proper warships. Their hulls showed signs of improvised modifications and repairs that suggested either limited manufacturing capabilities or a very different approach to ship design. Roy Adams, the human who identified himself as a captain, arrived aboard the Fortress with a small diplomatic team. The Alliance commanders studied their new allies with barely concealed disappointment. The humans were even more physically unimpressive in person, requiring environmental suits and breathing apparatus just to survive in the chambers carefully controlled atmosphere. Roy listened to their briefings about the Void Swarm with what appeared to be casual interest. He asked few questions about their enemies' capabilities or the Alliance's previous tactical failures. Instead, he focused on seemingly irrelevant details about supply lines, communication networks, and industrial capabilities. His team took extensive notes about topics that had little apparent connection to military strategy. When offered a formal tour of Alliance military installations, Roy politely declined. He explained that his people preferred to learn through direct experience rather than theoretical study. However, he did request complete access to their intelligence databases, tactical archives, and strategic planning systems. He claimed humans needed comprehensive information to understand what they called the operational environment. The Alliance commanders exchanged glances but agreed to his request. They had invited the humans to join their war effort, and sharing information was a necessary part of any alliance. Besides, their new allies seemed more interested in logistics and support operations than actual combat, which suggested they understood their limitations. As the human delegation prepared to return to their ships, Roy made one final request that surprised everyone. He asked for detailed maps of Void Swarm territory, including areas the Alliance had already written off as lost. When questioned about his intentions, he simply smiled and said his people liked to know the full scope of any problem they agreed to help solve. The Alliance had extended their invitation to the humans out of desperation, hoping for fresh perspectives on an impossible war. They had no idea they had just invited the galaxy's most dangerous predators to examine their prey. The mining world of Titan's Edge had become the Alliance's testing ground for their new human allies. Rich deposits of rare minerals made the planet strategically valuable, while its position on the edge of swarm territory provided an ideal location for defensive operations. The Alliance commanders positioned their forces according to established protocols, with Rockburn heavy units forming the primary battle line and Burnscale assault forces ready to exploit any breakthrough opportunities. Human ships took positions behind the main defensive grid, their smaller vessels appearing almost insignificant compared to the massive Alliance warships. Roy had explained that his people preferred to observe enemy tactics before committing to direct engagement, a strategy that reinforced the Alliance's assumption that humans understood their limitations in conventional warfare. The Void Swarm arrived exactly as predicted, emerging from jump space in perfect formation with mechanical precision. Thousands of dark ships moved like a single organism, their surfaces covered in the distinctive scarred metal that marked technology consumed and repurposed from previous victims. The swarm units immediately began their standard approach, advancing in waves designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. Alliance forces responded with practiced efficiency. Rockburn vessels opened fire with their massive kinetic cannons, hurling projectiles that could crack planetary surfaces. Burnscale ships unleashed streams of superheated plasma that turned space itself into a burning hell. Froskin units deployed their signature ice crystal munitions, creating vast fields of frozen debris that disrupted enemy formations. The initial exchange appeared to favor the Alliance. Dozens of swarm units died under the concentrated firepower, their destroyed hulks spinning away into the void. Alliance commanders began to feel optimistic about their chances, especially with human reinforcements waiting in reserve. Then the swarm adapted. Within minutes, the surviving units began incorporating defensive measures copied from the destroyed Alliance ships. Their hulls grew thicker where kinetic rounds had penetrated. Their surfaces developed reflective coatings that scattered plasma beams. Their formation shifted to minimize damage from ice crystal fields. The Alliance had seen this pattern before. Every weapon they used against the swarm eventually became useless as their enemy learned and evolved. The battle would continue until the swarm overwhelming them through pure attrition, converting Alliance ships into more swarm units for the next engagement. As the situation deteriorated, human ships began moving. Instead of reinforcing the battle line, they pulled back further from the combat zone. Roy's voice came across the communication channels, explaining that his forces were repositioning to better support Alliance operations, but his ships continued retreating. War Chief Blaze watched the human maneuvers with growing disgust. Her people had never retreated from any battle, regardless of the odds. The humans appeared to be abandoning their allies at the first sign of serious resistance, confirming her suspicions about their lack of courage. Meanwhile, Dr. Emma Wells worked frantically in her mobile laboratory aboard one of the human ships. Unlike the Alliance scientists who studied the void swarm from a safe distance, she had collected actual fragments from destroyed swarm units during the battle. Her examination methods shocked the Alliance observers who witnessed them through shared data feeds, where Alliance researchers treated swarm technology as dangerous alien artifacts requiring extreme containment protocols. Emma handled the fragments with casual efficiency. She dismantled their components, analyzed their molecular structure, and tested their responses to various stimuli with the methodical approach of someone solving a complex puzzle rather than investigating an existential threat. Her preliminary findings contradicted everything the Alliance believed about their enemy. The void swarm was not purely mechanical, as previously assumed. Buried deep within each unit were organic components, biological systems so heavily modified and augmented that they barely registered as living tissue. These organic cores appeared to coordinate the swarm's collective behavior and rapid adaptation capabilities. Engineer Tom Rivers took Emma's discoveries and began implementing modifications to human weapon systems that violated several Alliance warfare conventions. Instead of building bigger guns or stronger shields, he focused on developing targeted attacks against the organic components Emma had identified. His weapons were designed to cause specific types of biological damage rather than general destruction. The Alliance commanders received regular updates about human research activities but dismissed most of the findings as irrelevant to practical military operations. Emma's biological theories seemed overly complicated compared to the straightforward approach of destroying swarm units through superior firepower. Tom's weapon modifications appeared to be compensating for humanity's technological inferiority, rather than revealing genuine tactical innovations. As the battle at Titan's Edge reached its climax, Alliance forces prepared for their traditional fighting withdrawal. They had inflicted significant damage on the swarm but could not prevent the eventual outcome. The mining world would fall, its resources would be consumed, and the swarm would grow stronger for the next engagement. Then human ships returned to the combat zone, but not in the formation anyone expected. Instead of joining the battle line, they deployed throughout the system in seemingly random positions. Their modified weapons began targeting specific swarm units with unusual ammunition that appeared to have minimal destructive effect. Alliance observers noted that Tom's weapons seemed to barely damage their targets. Swarm units struck by human fire continued operating normally, showing no significant loss of capability. The humans appeared to be wasting their limited combat effectiveness on ineffective attacks that served no apparent tactical purpose. However, something strange began happening to the swarm's coordination. Units that had been struck by human weapons started displaying erratic behavior. Their perfect formation discipline broke down as individual ships began operating independently. Some units turned on their neighbors, attacking fellow swarm vessels with the same mechanical efficiency they had previously directed against Alliance forces. Emma's biological warfare approach was working. Tom's weapons were not designed to destroy swarm units, but to disrupt the organic components that controlled their collective behavior. The Void Swarm's greatest strength, their perfect coordination and shared learning capability, was becoming their greatest weakness as the biological virus spread through their network. Within hours, the entire swarm force had collapsed into chaotic infighting. Units consumed each other in mechanical fury, converting their fellow vessels into raw materials for new construction projects that served no strategic purpose. The Alliance watched in amazement as their seemingly inevitable defeat transformed into an unprecedented victory. Roy's voice came across the communication channels again, calmly requesting that Alliance forces maintain safe distance while human teams collected samples from the disabled swarm units. He explained that his people wanted to study their enemy's technology more thoroughly before the next engagement. The Alliance commanders agreed to his request, but privately they began to wonder what other surprises their human allies might have in store. The retreat that had appeared cowardly now looked like calculated preparation. The research that had seemed academic now proved to be decisive military intelligence. For the first time since the war began, the Deathworld Alliance had won a complete victory against the Void Swarm. They had their human allies to thank for the triumph, but they were beginning to suspect that humanity's approach to warfare was far more sophisticated than they had initially assumed. The fortress world of Iron Gate had never fallen to any enemy in 3,000 years of continuous warfare. Built into the heart of a dead star, its defenses had been designed by the greatest military minds of the Deathworld Alliance. Massive energy shields powered by stellar core tapped directly into the collapsed star's gravitational field. Weapon platforms carved from compressed matter could destroy entire fleets with single shots. The station represented everything the Alliance understood about impregnable defensive engineering. The Void Swarm had been besieging Iron Gate for 6 months, throwing wave after wave of ships against defenses that refused to break. Alliance commanders took pride in their successful stand, viewing the prolonged siege as proof that their traditional military doctrine remained sound. They had invited humans to observe their defensive masterpiece, expecting their allies to learn valuable lessons about proper fortress construction. Lieutenant Max Turner walked through the station's corridors with casual indifference to the ongoing battle raging outside. Explosions that would have sent Alliance personnel running for shelter barely registered on his awareness. He studied the defensive systems with the detached interest of someone examining an unusual but not particularly impressive piece of machinery. His observations confused the Alliance engineers who accompanied him on the tour. Where they saw ingenious solutions to complex defensive problems, Max pointed out potential failure points and alternative approaches. His questions focused on maintenance requirements, supply dependencies, and backup systems rather than the impressive firepower statistics that dominated Alliance thinking. When asked about his assessment of Iron Gate's defenses, Max offered polite compliments while privately noting that the entire station represented the most expensive single point of failure he had ever encountered. The Alliance had invested enormous resources into making one location absolutely impregnable, but they had created a system that would collapse completely if any critical component failed. Colonel Beth Kane operated from a different perspective entirely. While Alliance commanders focused on holding Iron Gate at all costs, she spent her time studying evacuation routes and resource distribution networks throughout the surrounding systems. Her analysis revealed uncomfortable truths about the Alliance's strategic situation that no one wanted to acknowledge. The fortress world had become a strategic liability rather than an asset. Its symbolic importance forced the Alliance to commit massive resources to its defense, resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. The Void Swarm had essentially trapped significant Alliance forces in a single location while continuing to expand elsewhere. Beth's proposed solution horrified the Alliance leadership. She suggested abandoning Iron Gate entirely, evacuating its personnel and equipment while simultaneously implementing scorched earth policies throughout the surrounding systems. Her plan called for systematic destruction of anything that might be useful to the swarm, turning the entire region into an economic desert. War Chief Blaze rejected the proposal immediately. Her people had never abandoned a fortress under siege, regardless of strategic considerations. The very suggestion violated fundamental principles of Burn-scale military honor. She argued that retreating from Iron Gate would send a message of weakness that would encourage swarm expansion throughout Alliance territory. Beth listened to the objections with patient attention, before explaining her reasoning in terms that gradually began to make disturbing sense. She was not proposing retreat, but rather strategic resource denial. The Void Swarm required raw materials and energy sources to maintain its expansion. By making entire systems economically worthless, they could force their enemy to seek resources elsewhere while buying time for more decisive action. Her approach treated the war not as a series of individual battles, but as a comprehensive resource management problem. The Alliance had been trying to destroy the swarm through superior firepower, but Beth saw the conflict as a competition for limited galactic resources. If they could control resource availability, they could control swarm behavior regardless of tactical outcomes. Meanwhile, Dr. Emma Wells continued her biological research with results that increasingly disturbed Alliance scientists. Her latest discovery suggested that the organic components controlling swarm behavior were not randomly distributed but formed a hierarchical network with identifiable command structures. More importantly, these biological systems showed signs of evolution and adaptation that went far beyond simple mechanical programming. Emma's theory proposed that the Void Swarm was not an ancient mechanical weapon as the Alliance had always assumed, but rather the final stage of evolution for some long-dead organic species. The mechanical components were tools created by biological intelligences that had gradually replaced their own organic bodies with technological alternatives. The process had continued for so long that even the swarm itself had forgotten its origins. This revelation completely changed human strategic thinking about the war. Where the Alliance saw an unstoppable mechanical plague, Emma saw a species that had made fundamental mistakes in its evolutionary development. The swarm's strength came from its collective intelligence and rapid adaptation, but these same qualities created exploitable weaknesses. Engineer Tom Rivers took Emma's research and developed weapons that targeted the swarm's evolutionary assumptions about survival and adaptation. Instead of trying to destroy swarm units directly, his new systems introduced controlled evolutionary pressures designed to make the collective intelligence work against itself. His weapons deployed modified viruses and bacteria that attacked the organic cores in ways that mimicked natural selection pressures. The swarm's automatic adaptation responses would incorporate these biological agents into their systems, while attempting to develop immunity. However, Tom's organisms were designed to evolve faster than the swarm could adapt, creating an evolutionary arms race that consumed enormous computational resources. The Alliance watched human preparations with growing unease. Their allies were developing weapons and strategies that operated on completely different principles from conventional warfare. Human approaches treated the enemy not as a military force to be defeated, but as a biological system to be manipulated and controlled. When Max finally implemented his assessment of Iron Gate's defenses, the results shocked everyone involved. Instead of reinforcing the station's weakest points, he systematically sabotaged its strongest systems, while creating alternative defensive networks that the Alliance had never considered necessary. His modifications turned Iron Gate from an impregnable fortress into what he called a controlled failure system. The station would still resist swarm attacks, but when it eventually fell, the collapse would be channeled in ways that maximized damage to the attacking forces while allowing controlled evacuation of personnel and critical equipment. The Alliance commanders protested that Max was deliberately weakening their defenses, but his response revealed the fundamental difference between human and Alliance military thinking. He explained that Iron Gate had never been truly impregnable, only expensive to destroy. The swarm would eventually find ways to overcome any static defense, but they could control the timing and consequences of that inevitable failure. Beth's resource denial operations began showing results within weeks. Swarm expansion slowed in. Sectors where human teams had implemented systematic destruction of mining operations, manufacturing facilities, and energy collection systems. The enemy found itself forced to divert resources from military operations to basic resource gathering in areas that had been deliberately made as inefficient as possible. Emma's biological warfare campaign produced even more dramatic effects. Entire swarm fleets began experiencing coordination failures as the evolutionary arms race consumed increasing portions of their collective processing power. Units that should have been expanding into new territory instead found themselves locked in internal computational struggles against biological agents they could neither eliminate nor fully adapt to. The humans were not fighting the void swarm in ways the Alliance recognized as warfare. They were treating their enemy as a complex system to be analyzed, manipulated, and ultimately controlled. Their approach required patience, scientific method, and willingness to accept short-term losses in exchange for long-term systematic advantages. Most disturbing of all, human methods were working with an efficiency that made Alliance military doctrine look primitive by comparison. The Deathworld Alliance had survived every galactic threat through superior toughness and firepower, but their human allies were demonstrating that intelligence and adaptability could be far more effective than raw strength. As the Siege of Iron Gate entered its final phase, Alliance commanders began to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. The humans were not just helping them win individual battles against the Void Swarm. They were systematically dismantling their enemy through methods that operated on levels the Alliance had never considered relevant to warfare. The Void Swarm's final assault came not as a military offensive, but as an act of consumption on a scale that defied galactic comprehension. Sensor networks throughout Alliance space detected massive movement in the deep void between star systems. The enemy had been building something enormous in the darkness, using resources stripped from thousands of conquered worlds to create vessels so large they registered as artificial moons. When the swarm fleet emerged from jump space above the Alliance core worlds, the scale of the threat became immediately apparent. Each mothership stretched across hundreds of kilometers, their surfaces covered in manufacturing facilities designed to convert entire planets into more swarm units. Smaller vessels swarmed around them like insects, numbering in the millions, and continuing to multiply as mobile factories worked at full capacity. Ambassador Thane transmitted emergency evacuation orders throughout Rockburn space as the first mothership entered orbit around his species' capital world. The massive vessel began deploying industrial equipment that could strip away planetary atmospheres and process crustal material into raw construction materials. Within hours, the ancient Rockburn homeworld would be reduced to its component elements and converted into additional swarm units. War Chief Blez faced a similar situation as swarm forces surrounded the Burnscale military headquarters deep within a stellar core facility. Her people prepared for their final battle with the grim satisfaction of warriors who had never known defeat. They would die as they had lived, fighting impossible odds with weapons that burned as hot as the stars themselves. Ice Commander Frost watched from the outer system as evacuation ships fled the frozen worlds her people had called home for millennia. The Frostkin had always understood patience, but even their legendary endurance meant nothing against an enemy that could simply wait while converting their worlds into industrial facilities. The Alliance had faced defeat before, but never annihilation on this scale. The Void Swarm was not content with military victory. It intended to consume every Alliance world, converting 3 ancient civilizations into raw materials for continued expansion. Within weeks, millions of years of cultural development would be erased as completely as if they had never existed. Then Admiral Kate Ross arrived with the human response to the crisis, and everything changed in ways that violated fundamental assumptions about warfare, survival, and sanity itself. Her fleet emerged from jump space not around the embattled Alliance worlds, but in the deep interstellar void where the swarm had built its manufacturing base. Human ships began deploying what appeared to be standard scientific equipment, research probes and atmospheric processors that seemed pathetically inadequate against the industrial might of the enemy. Motherships. Alliance observers monitoring. The human deployment initially assumed they were witnessing some form of scientific surrender. Kate's ships made no attempt to engage swarm forces directly. Instead, they released billions of small capsules into the void, each one containing what human reports described as biological specimens from Earth's ecosystem. The first sign that something unprecedented was happening came when swarm ships began reporting system malfunctions. Their perfect hull integrity started developing microscopic breaches that spread like cracks through crystal. Internal systems that had operated flawlessly for millennia began failing as unknown contaminants spread through their mechanical networks. Kate's voice came across Alliance communication channels with calm satisfaction as she explained what her people had done. The capsules contained modified Earth bacteria, organisms that had evolved to survive in conditions that would sterilize most worlds. These microorganisms had been further engineered to consume the specific metal alloys and synthetic materials that comprised swarm technology. The Alliance watched in horrified fascination as billions of years of evolutionary adaptation became weaponized on an interstellar scale. Earth bacteria designed to break down organic matter had been modified to treat swarm ships as an unlimited food source. The microorganisms multiplied exponentially as they consumed enemy vessels from the inside out, spreading through the interconnected swarm network faster than any conventional weapon could travel. But Kate's biological assault was only the beginning of humanity's response. As swarm motherships began losing structural integrity, human engineering teams moved in with equipment that defied every principle of safe operational procedure. They worked directly in the vacuum of space without environmental suits, using only basic breathing apparatus and radiation shielding that would have been inadequate for Alliance personnel. The humans were not just immune to conditions that would kill other species. They thrived in environments that had been designed to be uninhabitable. Tom Rivers personally directed salvage operations inside failing swarm vessels, breathing recycled air and working in radiation levels that should have been lethal within minutes. His team systematically dismantled swarm technology while the ships were still operational, extracting critical components and reverse engineering systems that had taken the enemy millions of years to develop. Within days, human ships began incorporating swarm improvements into their own designs, adapting enemy innovations faster than the swarm itself could respond to the bacterial attack. Emma Wells worked directly with infected swarm units, studying their biological responses to the bacterial assault with the casual efficiency of someone conducting routine laboratory experiments. She collected samples from dying enemy vessels, analyzed their adaptation attempts, and developed new bacterial strains designed to overcome any immunity the swarm might develop. Her approach treated the entire galactic conflict as an exercise in evolutionary biology rather than warfare. The Void Swarm represented a failed evolutionary experiment, a species that had traded biological adaptability for mechanical perfection. Emma was simply correcting their mistake by reintroducing evolutionary pressures they could no longer handle. Alliance evacuation fleets watched from safe distance as human operations expanded throughout former swarm territory. What had begun as a desperate defensive action became a systematic acquisition program as humans claimed technology, resources, and territory with efficiency that made the original swarm expansion look slow and careful. The humans were not fighting the Void Swarm in any conventional sense. They were digesting it. Earth's hostile biosphere had been weaponized and deployed against an enemy that had forgotten how to deal with biological threats. The result was not victory but absorption, as human civilization incorporated everything useful from their defeated opponents. Max Turner led teams that established permanent research stations inside conquered swarm motherships, using the enemy's own manufacturing facilities to build human colonies and industrial complexes. His people treated the hostile conditions inside alien vessels as minor inconveniences rather than existential threats. Alliance observers noted that humans seemed to adapt to new environments faster than their equipment could be modified to support them. Personnel who should have required extensive life support systems instead made casual adjustments to hostile conditions and continued working with minimal technological assistance. Beth Kane coordinated the systematic expansion of human territory into regions that had been considered uninhabitable even by Deathworld Alliance standards. Her teams established colonies in asteroid fields, built cities inside stellar coronas, and created industrial facilities in the vacuum between star systems where no other species could survive. The scope of human expansion revealed uncomfortable truths about their true nature. They were not simply another hardy species that had adapted to a difficult homeworld. They were predators whose entire evolutionary development had been shaped by conditions so hostile that they treated galactic warfare as a relatively mild challenge. As the last swarm mothership succumbed to biological assault and human salvage operations, Alliance leaders began to understand what they had actually accomplished by inviting humanity into their war. They had not found allies to help them survive an existential threat. They had introduced the galaxy's apex predators to an unlimited supply of resources and technology. The Void Swarm had been defeated, but its defeat had revealed that the real threat to galactic stability had never been mechanical plague spreading through star systems. The real threat was a species so adapted to hostile conditions that they could weaponize anything, including the very concept of survival itself. Alliance evacuation fleets found themselves in the unprecedented position of being refugees in their own territory, watching human expansion with the growing realization that their salvation had become their replacement. The Deathworld Alliance had survived every previous crisis through superior toughness and determination, but those qualities seemed primitive compared to humanity's casual mastery of conditions that transcended conventional understanding of survival. 6 months after the final swarm mothership fell silent, the galaxy looked entirely different from the one that had faced extinction. Human colonies spread through former enemy territory like a technological plague, establishing settlements in locations that defied conventional understanding of habitable space. They built cities inside neutron star magnetospheres, created agricultural facilities in the vacuum between galaxies, and developed industrial complexes that operated using principles no other species had imagined possible. General Paul Stone reviewed the transformation from his command center aboard what had once been the largest swarm mothership. The massive vessel now served as humanity's primary research and development facility, its original manufacturing systems upgraded with improvements that made the original swarm technology look primitive by comparison. Human engineers had not simply repaired the conquered ship, but had fundamentally redesigned it, using principles that incorporated biological adaptability into mechanical systems. The Alliance evacuation fleets remained in their temporary settlements throughout human-controlled space, technically free to return to their homeworlds, but increasingly aware that they no longer had homeworlds to return to. Human expansion had transformed every Alliance system into something unrecognizable, optimized for efficiency and resource utilization in ways that made the original inhabitants feel like strangers in their own territory. Ambassador Thane attempted to access the Rockburn capital world only to discover that human terraforming operations had converted the entire planetary surface into a hybrid biological-mechanical ecosystem. The volcanic hellscape his people had called home for millions of years now hosted Earth organisms that thrived in molten rock while simultaneously supporting manufacturing facilities that produced technology beyond Alliance comprehension. War Chief Blaze found her people's stellar core installations upgraded with human improvements that multiplied their energy output by factors that violated known physics. Human engineers had somehow convinced the stars themselves to burn more efficiently, creating power sources that fed industrial complexes, capable of manufacturing entire fleets within days rather than years. Ice Commander Frost discovered that human expansion into the frozen outer systems had created something unprecedented in galactic history. They had built civilization in regions where no other species could survive, creating communities that existed in conditions colder than absolute zero through technological methods that seemed to rewrite fundamental laws of thermodynamics. The humans offered polite explanations for their territorial acquisitions. They claimed to be conducting necessary cleanup operations in former swarm territory, ensuring that no biological or technological remnants could regenerate into future threats. Their expansion was presented as temporary occupation required for galactic security rather than permanent settlement, however. Alliance observers noted that human cleanup operations seemed to result in permanent improvements to everything they touched. Planets that had been strip-mined by the swarm became more productive than they had been before the war. Star systems that had been devastated by conflict emerged from human administration with resources and capabilities that exceeded their pre-war potential. Paul's final briefing to Alliance leadership revealed the true scope of what humanity had accomplished during their brief involvement in galactic affairs. The war against the Void Swarm had provided an unprecedented opportunity to field test human military capabilities against threats that operated on scales their own species had never encountered. The results exceeded all projections. Human forces had not simply defeated the swarm, but had absorbed its technology, improved upon its methods, and scaled up their own capabilities to levels that made their pre-war civilization look like a primitive experiment. They had used the galactic conflict as a catalyst for evolutionary development that compressed millions of years of normal advancement into a few months of intensive warfare. Paul explained his people's gratitude to the Alliance for providing such an excellent testing ground for human potential. The invitation to join the Deathworld Alliance had given humanity access to threats, technologies, and opportunities that would have taken centuries to discover through normal exploration and development. The Void Swarm had been particularly valuable as an opponent because it operated on scales and used methods that pushed human adaptability to its limits. Fighting an enemy that could consume star systems and convert entire civilizations into industrial resources had forced humanity to develop capabilities they had never known they possessed. Alliance leaders listened to Paul's briefing with growing horror as they realized the implications of his casual admissions. The humans had not joined their war effort out of altruism or shared interests. They had used the entire conflict as an opportunity to test their species' potential against the most dangerous threats the galaxy could provide. Every battle, every technological exchange, every moment of cooperation had been analyzed and incorporated into human understanding of galactic power structures. They had studied Alliance species not as allies but as potential future challenges, cataloging their capabilities and identifying their limitations with scientific thoroughness. The invitation that had seemed like humanity's salvation had actually been their graduation examination. The Deathworld Alliance had unknowingly provided the final test that qualified humans for expansion beyond their home system. The war against the Void Swarm had proven that their species was ready to compete on a galactic scale. Paul's conclusion shattered the last illusions about humanity's role in recent events. He thanked the Alliance for their cooperation in what he described as humanity's most successful military exercise. The defeat of the Void Swarm had demonstrated that Earth-based civilization could handle any threat the galaxy might present, clearing the way for unlimited human expansion. As human fleets began moving beyond former swarm territory into unexplored regions of space, Alliance members realized they were witnessing the emergence of something unprecedented in galactic history. They had always assumed that Deathworld species were survivors, tough organisms that had adapted to harsh conditions through superior endurance and resilience. Humans revealed the fallacy in that assumption. They were not survivors who had learned to endure hostile conditions. They were predators who had learned to thrive by making everything else adapt to them. Their homeworld had not produced a hardy species through natural selection, but had instead created apex predators capable of weaponizing the very concept of adaptation itself. The Alliance species had survived their respective homeworlds by becoming tougher, more resilient, and better equipped to handle extreme conditions. Humans had survived Earth by learning to make extreme conditions work for them. The difference was fundamental and terrifying in its implications for galactic civilization. Roy Adams made one final appearance before Alliance leadership as human expansion entered its next phase. His diplomatic facade had been replaced by casual honesty about humanity's true intentions and capabilities. He explained that his people appreciated the Alliance's role in introducing them to galactic-scale challenges, but their partnership had served its purpose. The humans were moving beyond the need for allies or cooperation. They had absorbed everything useful from Alliance technology and methodology while developing capabilities that made traditional galactic civilization obsolete. Future expansion would proceed according to human priorities rather than diplomatic considerations. Roy's farewell carried an undertone of polite dismissal that chilled Alliance observers. He spoke as if the ancient civilizations that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years were now irrelevant curiosities, interesting primarily for historical study rather than ongoing political considerations. The Alliance members found themselves in the unprecedented position of being obsolete in their own territory. Human expansion had not conquered their worlds so much as improved them beyond recognition. They were welcome to remain in human space, but as guests rather than equals, dependent on their former allies for access to technology and resources that had once belonged to them. Thane's final log entry captured the magnitude of their miscalculation with crystalline clarity. The Deathworld Alliance had survived every galactic catastrophe by being tougher and more resilient than their enemies. They had invited humanity into their war because they needed allies who could match their legendary endurance and determination. Instead, they had discovered that true Deathworld evolution did not produce survivors. It produced replacements. Species so adapted to hostile conditions that they treated galactic civilization itself as another environment to be conquered and improved. The Rockburn ambassador's last official transmission stated the reality with geological finality. They had sought allies from a Deathworld to help them survive an existential threat. They had found their replacements. Human expansion continued beyond the former boundaries of Alliance space, carrying Earth-based civilization into regions that had never been explored by previous galactic powers. They moved with the casual confidence of predators entering territory that had never known competition at their level. The galaxy would adapt to human presence, just as everything else had learned to adapt or be replaced. The Void Swarm had been their first major opponent, but it would not be their last. Humanity had learned to thrive by making the impossible merely difficult and the difficult merely routine. The Deathworld Alliance watched human ships disappear into unexplored space and realized they had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. They had not just lost a war or been conquered by superior force. They had been made obsolete by a species that operated according to principles they had never imagined possible. The final irony was that humanity's success came not from rejecting Alliance methods but from treating them as starting points for further development. Everything the Alliance had accomplished through millions of years of evolution, humans had improved upon within months of exposure. They had not been defeated by their replacements. They had simply been upgraded past the point of relevance by allies who had learned to weaponize improvement itself. The invitation that had seemed like salvation had been their final error, introducing the galaxy to predators who treated cooperation as another form of conquest. In the end, the Deathworld Alliance's greatest mistake had been assuming that they represented the pinnacle of what hostile evolution could produce. They had never encountered a species that treated Deathworld conditions not as challenges to be survived, but as resources to be exploited. Humanity had shown them what true apex predators looked like when they decided the galaxy was ready for improvement.